Usually we have Fred introduce this session, but we're having some fun with power outages in and around Ottawa. So I'm going to try and roll with this live and do the session until either Fred joins or we wrap up. I see Fred's trying to join here now, but with 47 participants and time ticking 48 now, time ticking away. Unless I hear from Fred, I'm going to go ahead. So thanks for having me. Thanks to Helicopter Association of Canada HAC for having me. For those that don't know me, I'm Nick Robinson. I'm the Director General of Civil Aviation. I think the last time we were on a full or a HAC meeting was just last week. Speaking about the vaccine mandate, but here I'm gonna speak a little bit, actually quite briefly. I don't have a presentation. It's the approach I'm taking this year, not because I don't love the stand up and go through the regular few slides that we seem to present year over year, but having been in this position for going on to 4 years, I feel that the regulatory triangle that we often go through and a couple of slides are something folks see year in year again and are accessible online and can be accessible through our KRAC sessions. And I think the more advantageous thing with these presentations is to get to you to ask questions and comments and seek thoughts on a variety of different things. But before we get into that, I will have to say a few really key things. And first, it's a message that I've been bringing out across industry and trying to promote as well. And that is an incredible thank you to all of you for what has been an absolutely devastating and at times disruptive, surely at all times, and extremely challenging last number of months, 18 odd months. I know many of you have had to change course, have had to adapt, have had to shut down parts of your business model and then reopen them again, only to shut them down again or adapt them again over the pandemic. But a particular note, I want to also recognize the devastating year, not only that the pandemic has had to play, but that number of natural disasters that we've had in Canada have had, and a thank you on how the operators here as part of HAC have stepped up to provide support during those, as well as the pandemic. And we see that now in BC, and we saw that in BC earlier this year and across the country as we've grappled with a number of different events that has of course turned to aviation and asked for aviation to respond in order to assist. So thank you. I hope that and over the next hour, I hope that we can look at a few different things that I hope just that you see us starting to turn the corner on what has been such a disruptive and challenging number of months, well over a year. And on that, and on the turning of the corner, I would say that from a COVID mitigation perspective, we had a conversation about the mitigations around vaccine that are coming into force, and that came into force on at the end of October. The phased approach that we're turning to on November 30th and then onwards. I hope to say that is probably the last significant mitigation that we will see with regards to COVID-19. And from here, we shift on the reduction of particular mitigation. perfect example of that is what went along with the announcement last week around PCR testing and the ability now to allow and permit individuals from Canadians that are vaccinated to cross the border and come back from the United States without the need for a 72-hour PCR or molecular test. Recognizing one, the epidemiology of the situation, and two, the benefits that are conferred on individuals that have the vaccine, and along with those benefits, there should be some leniency on certain measures that we put in place. We've seen, as far as the welcoming of international guests, what in the heart of the pandemic, we had about only 4 airports allowing international guests. As of November 30th, we have an expansion to 18 airports. And I do hope that it's only a matter of time where we see a further expansion of those airports, or that there is no longer a need to restrict international guests arriving at airport, and instead we go back to what we were all very familiar with regards to CBSA, identifying points of entry for international guests, and that process to take place, whether to clear them via telephone or via meeting individuals. During the heart of the pandemic, over the pandemic, we issued about 240 different exemptions specific to the pandemic. These were on top of exemptions that we issued on a regular basis, and which we issue about 160 odd exemptions throughout a year. On a typical year, we issued an additional 250 over the pandemic. And as you're very familiar with, those were exemptions that were related to the extension of proficiency limits, changes to training, special authorizations for particular movements or entries, and the list goes on. I can say that we are now down to about 40 active live exemptions with regards to COVID-19, and we continue to look at those. But again, it shows that there's a movement to the regularization of the industry, hopefully moving forward, and that we're not reliant on these additional measures. And I understand absolutely that these initial measures bring additional burdens for your operations, and it's trying to alleviate some of that. As we move forward, I think you'll also see, and I know Transport Canada is now much more out and visiting with individuals with regards to oversight. We've started to reactivate some of our policy and regulatory files that we would like to address, and that includes SMS. It includes how we are going to address approach bans, regulations, icing regulations, a variety of different areas that we'd like to start to move forward on, but that we decided, and we decided through consultations with individuals like yourselves, associations, through participation with Fred and other associations, that we needed to, while we did have a very, very active regulatory agenda over the last 18 months leading up to the pandemic, we needed to slow our regulatory agenda down, because there was an opportunity for operators to comment on those regulations, to identify areas of concern or areas that they wanted TC to focus on more. So again, as we move forward into the winter and spring of 2022, you'll see an upstart of that, which again is a good sign that we're moving towards away from this absolute focus on COVID-19 and more towards back into the aviation industry. And I'll be very interested in hearing from all of you with regards to where you'd like to see Transport Canada go as we again move back to a greater. We didn't lose focus during the pandemic on aviation, but we had to incorporate public health into those conversations. And well, we'll remember to keep some of the lessons learned that we brought in those public health discussions on how to address public health risks within aviation. We do want to shift more and a greater absolute focus on aviation moving forward. I know that there's probably a number of items that you'll want to discuss, and I will leave that to those questions. I would be remiss to say one thing I would mention, because I know we had a conversation about it on Friday, but I'll reconfirm it here, especially for those that weren't able to join that conversation on Friday. And that's if we look towards the year ahead, one particular challenge, it's absolutely a challenge that we need to move and focus attention on, is the incoming fatigue, flight and duty time regulations, duty time regulations, and the possible use of FRMS for individuals. That is a massive regulatory regime. It always was a massive regulatory regime. In the context of the pandemic, there are additional challenges with regards to that regime. And Transport Canada is trying to address particular questions that operators have had on how to implement that. But what I want to say here, and for folks to understand, is there are no plans to delay that regulation from coming into force at the end of December of next year, not this year. And so I really do hope that individuals have that on their radar, that they are working towards what that implementation looks like within your business for those that it applies to, and that you reach out early, either through your association or through your POI, on questions you might have with regards to those regulations, and we work through those challenges. Because it is something that we look forward to welcoming in at the end of the next calendar year, and then moving towards the full implementation phase, as opposed to the leading up that we've had for over a decade with regards to these regulations. With that, Fred, I've taken 15 minutes, which I had focused on trying to do. I'm going to, and I don't know if you're on your phone anymore. You look better than you might have the power back on.
We did. It did come back on. So
okay, I'll turn to you to navigate through some questions, and happy to answer anything that you may have.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Nick. And my apologies to you and everyone else for being late here. Just as we were about to begin the session, we had a complete power failure in the area. It wasn't just this location, but everywhere in the area. So with my apologies for that, it was completely beyond our control, but we are back up and running now, admittedly a little bit late. So Nick, I wanted to start out by thanking you for your participation here. It's become a bit of a staple in our convention, face-to-face or virtual. So thank you for that. Extraordinary year, the worst year on record in terms of the pandemic and its effect on the aviation industry. We had a good fire season, but in terms of a very busy fire season, but we're still in recovery mode very much, and will be for a few years, because many operators, some didn't survive and others dug themselves a hole that during the pandemic that they'll have to spend 2 or 3 years digging out of. But you've already touched on one of the issues as it relates to fatigue management. We're going to experience some real challenges in the industry recovering from the pandemic. And it's going to be sort of a 1-2-3 punch, if you will, for the industry between recovering from the pandemic, the new fatigue management rules, and the additional costs that have been shouldered largely by the airport and air carrier community for the new vaccine mandate as well. So our industry is sort of reeling from all of this. I accept your comments as they relate to the fatigue management rules, but I hope you'll understand, when the association continues to push, at least to have these delayed and perhaps to bring some clarity to the application of the new rules to the helicopter industry, because it's going to be complicated and it's going to be quite oppressive. So let me look.
And Fred, on that, you know, I wouldn't expect anything other than you bringing the points with regards to fatigue management up. But I did want to make sure, because it was a question that came up as we were going through the pandemic, when the 705 operators were faced with all the devastation in the midst of really the heart of that would have been the second wave, and the request to consider whether the fatigue rules were delayed. And at that point, at time, we did examine. The government took the decision that the fatigue rules would continue, and for the most part, we've seen. It was not, for anyone who looked to expect that it wouldn't be disruptive. I think, given the magnitude of the rules that were coming in, it was going to be disruptive, but the disruption has been managed to date with regards to the 705 operators. There's still implementation challenges, and we still work with particular operators and groups of operators on implementation challenges. From a TC perspective, and I hope everyone would agree with this, but happy to hear discussions of those that don't agree. We do work with operators on correcting non-compliance as best we can, not penalizing right away. When you look at a rule set like this, we've taken absolutely the approach to where are the challenges that operators are having and how can we help them come into compliance, as opposed to taking that heavy stick right off the bat. We're all learning with regards to this fatigue regulation, and we'll continue to learn as other subparts are brought in, and then the uniqueness within the subparts. And Fred, as you mentioned, helicopter operations is a perfect example of the uniqueness and how we can work through them.
Right. And I guess one of the concerns that we've raised, Nick, and will continue to raise, is that FRMS, we've had multiple presentations, the HAC board, from companies that are prepared to take our operator members and the association through the process of finding FRMS relief. And it is universally very costly and complicated to do for a small operator. So that I would I would argue that virtually all of the operators in Canada, except possibly for the very largest, will be limited to using the prescriptive rules, which are going to be extremely difficult to implement for the helicopter industry in seasonal operations and northern operations. Many of the points that we've made before, but I'd like to say right now, because this is what I'm hearing from my members, is that when the rubber hits the road, and if they're implemented in their current form, we're going to see a lot of aircraft grounded because of a shortage of flight crews. And then you couple that with the effects of the pandemic at this stage, and losing other employees as a result of vaccine mandate, as well experienced people. We've had a shortage in our industry for years, under circumstances where the industry is busy. So this is just going to make it very, very difficult, and you're going to see an impact. You're going to see an impact, as it relates to a number of different operations in our industry, some of them essential services. We had undertaken at the outset to this session has historically been devoted to questions from people in the audience. So I'd like to pause here for a minute to invite anyone to offer up any questions using the Q&A feature in the lower right-hand side of your screen, which says Q&A, and type in your questions there, and I can try to answer them, or Nick can try to answer them if you pose them in that setting. Nick, going forward, let me sort of seed a couple of questions here, and I'll change gears from the fatigue management regulations that are coming to the new vaccine mandate. Are you aware of any discussion inside government about an effort to defer the costs to industry for having to accomplish this sort of thing? It's resulted in a whole new administration and bureaucracy, for checking and attestations and processing exemptions, and it's going to be a huge cost on an industry that's already sagging under the weight of other regulatory initiatives right now. Are you aware of anything that's underway?
So, Fred, I'm not aware of anything that's underway to look at that, but I also have not received any specific submission. Now, that's not to say, and I don't want to suggest it hasn't, but from incoming to civil aviation, I haven't seen any submission by associations or particular industries on the estimated cost of delivery. I think very similar to when the work was underway around, and I know it was limited, having not been directly part of it. I saw it from a bit of a distance around helping small and medium airports, air operators during the pandemic 2 summers ago, I guess now, partnership with provinces and territories. I did see association submissions, operator submissions around costs that they were looking at there, but I haven't seen it with regards to the pandemic. So I would be very interested in one, receiving that, but also advocating for that internal to government if you have it.
I see. All right. Well, thank you. That's one option that we will pursue. I got one question in the chat section, and it it's a question. The recent COVID vaccine mandates, and before that, the implementation of the 28-day rule for cannabis use were handled in a less than ideal manner. Both left our company scrambling to find answers and guidance. We understand that both are driven by political agendas. Can you offer any assurance that TC will attempt to seek input from comments in a more organized, less urgent manner for future regulation implementation? And I've had a number of concerns. I mean, you know better than anybody what a flurry of interim orders and guidance material have been flying about recently insofar as the vaccine mandate is concerned. It certainly puts extreme pressure on the industry and the associations to respond. And quite frankly, operators are ill prepared to make a submission, on 24 hours notice, 48, 36 hours notice is the sort of lead time we've been getting for some of these things. So
I fully understand that the vaccine mandate and the way it rolled out, and actually, let's face, I'll recognize the vaccine mandate. I'll recognize PCR testing for international travelers. Let's see, health checks, all of that rolled out within moments, and very little consultation on that. It really did roll out on a rapid basis, and I know that it did leave companies, and I heard from companies across the board scrambling to figure out, okay, so how do we do it? Guidance coming out the day, final guidance coming out the day that the regulations were coming into force, or through the interim order. And all I can say there is I very much recognize the position that it put you in, and it's not something that we want to make as a business practice. I am interested in the association with the 28-day rule for cannabis. I didn't see that, and I haven't heard until now the reference that came out in a less than ideal manner. From the 28-day rule perspective, it very much is aligned with other as cannabis as the cannabis legislation came into force, it very much aligned with policies that we had seen across governments and across across other parts of the industry, not the industry, across Canada, and also very much lined up with the commonly understood science of how the body rids itself of cannabis. So I'd be interested to hear more, either offline or here, the thought of how that was kind of dropped on industry too quickly. And again, hearing from you and then trying to figure out how do we adjust. I can say from the 28-day rule, there is no look at changing that anytime soon. We continue to see that is the approach we want to incorporate as part of our medical certification process.
There's another question, Nick, and it is jumping back to fatigue management again. I've heard from a number of operators that some of the problems with implementing the new fatigue management rules will only become apparent, as we start to implement them. I mean, under the current rules, we have operators that are keeping machines on the ground because they can't find experienced crews to operate them. I get calls last couple of years, not so much the year before last, but certainly this year, looking for crews in years before that. I think, and my question for you is, moving on beyond the question that has popped up, is, will Transport Canada be open to specific chafing points with the new regulations, if it is apparent that it's going to result in an extremely difficult or impossible scenario for operators to deal with? And I don't just mean for shortages of crews, but I mean for scenarios where you would have to triple crew or double crew a single engine aircraft in the field to accommodate the new rules. And we're preparing a submission that will highlight some of these areas so that when they do come into force, at the very least, you'll see the reason that we see them coming.
So it's definitely the first time I heard chafing, the reference, but I'll speak to that. So I think in any regulatory piece, provision, or a new regime like we have with fatigue, there will be an ability, and actually we spoke to it when we were looking at the overall approach to COVID, 240 exemptions. So those were exemptions to the cars. Some of them we'll learn from COVID, and we might codify into it. I think we will codify some into the cars. Some will go to the wayside. We know even before COVID-19, we had global exemptions, long-standing global exemptions. A lot of the work that Marcia and now Sandra and her regulatory affairs group did around the CARS review, regulatory review, where we'd be taking things which were clear. We had risk assessments to support an exemption to a particular piece of regulation as it relates to either an operation, a part, a certain circumstance or timing, all of that. And we have those exemptions in place. So we have the tools in place where we may see that we need some ability to distance or to separate the regulation from a particular condition or set of conditions. So that is available. But we also have to understand that the exemption process is along the lines of, first, there has to be a clear risk assessment done. And it has to clearly demonstrate that it's not introducing an additional risk by exempting an operation or a condition from the regulations. And then it goes to your point, Fred, and then there has to be a public interest argument then. So if there's a condition where we say, okay, this doesn't present any additional risk, and I'm not going to speak to a particular case, but we do a risk assessment, doesn't present any additional risk, and it's preventing particular operations from crewing in particular settings. Well, that's a public interest piece. You could see an exemption. You could see an exemption issued for that regulation. But that's in all of our civil aviation regulations. We have that tool to be able to roll out.
I understand. The again, another question has come up here. The suggestion is we're jumping back to vaccine mandates, and it's about the more balanced approach to vaccine mandates dictate that the rules should only apply to 705 operators and not smaller 703, 704 operations. The bulk of travelers on the larger airlines who have the infrastructure to deal with the logistics with these mandates. And just to invite your views on that. I appreciate that, the objective of the government is to drive people who don't want to be vaccinated to get vaccinated. But our entire system, at least in aviation, is predicated on less stringent rules as it applies to small operators because they simply can't implement them. And why isn't the same principle extended to the application of the vaccine mandate?
It's interesting, the vaccine rules that have come out, because you're bang on. When we look at aviation safety, for the most part, we look at identifying subparts that are implicated in a regulation. And in this one, it actually looked at where subparts operate. And if you're part of the 81 designated airports, if you hit it in any part of your operations, all of a sudden your passengers needed to fit into that vaccine mandate rule, as well as your operations. There may be, as we look at, and it's not to reduce the reach. If we look at the purpose of this requirement, it is to promote safe aviation travel, safe travel in aviation, as well as to promote vaccination amongst Canadians and amongst those traveling in Canada. We may, though, look, and what I've heard, I'm going to turn the question a bit. We've heard where an operation, say a particular flight training unit, perfect example, flight training unit that is operating out of one of the designated airports in a critical area, there have the vaccine mandate applied to their operations. But then another flight training unit, not one of the designated airports, don't have that vaccine mandate applied to it. Well, there's a disconnect there, because the individual is at, and could be argued both ways, actually, depending on what students are coming in, but could be argued as a bit of a disadvantage, where a rule is applying to the same operation, but differently depending on where you're located. So I think moving forward, we wouldn't be carving out the 703, 704 operations, but I think we may begin to looking at regulating by subpart versus regulating by location. But that would have to be a shift, and I wouldn't say without a doubt that would be an approach of where we're going, but it could be another way where we address those inconsistencies where one operator is impacted and another operator in the exact same subpart undertaking the exact same activity within the subpart is not implicated.
Right, I understand. And I mean, I think it's comforting that you're at least open to that discussion or thinking about it, because traditionally we have based our the regulations have incorporated the complexity of systems to manage the risk are more stringent as you go up through 703, 704, 705. And so that's, we're used to seeing that. So that to do it all of a sudden by airport size is a bit of a wonky metric, or a wonky tool for applying it to 705 operators that go into that airport, as well as 703 operators that go into that airport. It just is, there's a disconnect for sure. So,
and so So it is a much different approach than what we're used to, and we do recognize that, and we recognize how that has set up some discrepancies between identical operations.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. We've seen over the several years a decentralization of regulatory oversight, leaving more determination or authority at the regional inspector's discretion. This ultimately leads to regional disparity in a federally regulated industry. Is it the position of the minister to maintain the practice of regional interpretation, or there will be a swing back to national oversight? I appreciate, because I was around at the time many years ago when, this was all done in the name of empowering inspectors to, not send every interpretation back to Ottawa, and to allow them to make decisions on the ground in a more timely way and giving them more authority. But I think the question is a valid one, because we often see things you can do in one region that you can't do in another in a matter of federal regulatory jurisdiction. And I know there have been, systems implemented at transport to try to minimize that. But the reality is, I believe that there are just too many decisions being taken on the ground, in the moment, that have resulted in a very uneven playing field between operators who are supposed to be able to operate from coast to coast using the same rule book.
Yeah. So, and I was speaking about this same issue last week as well. Well, there needs to be a consistency across regions, absolutely, and there shouldn't be something of a view that individuals should be playing outside of a different rule book depending on the region you find. I think there's also a very, very, very important part of having the ability for regional POIs, regional inspectors, to take decisions based on their own, based on the circumstances of the operation. I hear from operators all the time, operating in the northern part of BC is a much different operational subset than operating within Ontario. And I need some accommodation with that. We just spoke about accommodations within the fatigue rules and potential exemptions that are in place. I think the regional inspector model allows for some of that adaptation and to recognize some of the unique operations, and to be able to take a regulation and be able to apply it with a safety lens on an operation, but it may be slightly different on how it's applied somewhere else. That I think is beneficial to a degree. And I think then there's the piece, and I actually saw, I don't know if it's still there and I don't know where it went. There was a question here about Class D HEC operations. There it is. And I'll say that's where there was an interpretation in one region and an interpretation in other regions, and it did drastically change how the permissiveness of that sort of operation. That's where we have to, and from a national perspective, we believe that there was an interpretation that went outside of how the regulation was crafted. So that's where I lean on operators, I lean on associations, and I lean on the discussions we have internally as we go through all of the regulatory approach within the civil aviation and the training within the civil aviation, is where there is an interpretation that you have a concern with, that you feel is misaligned to how it's being interpreted across the country. You have to come to your regional director, you have to come to your association, you have to come to me or the associate DG Andy Cook and outline your concerns there. I think I hope in looking back at even throughout the last year, but over the last 3 years, I think we've been able to pivot where those alternative interpretations have been presented to us, and where we see there's something wrong with them. But we will continue to allow some flexibility with regional inspectors to apply them in their unique geographic or demographic or operator circumstance.
Okay, thank you. There was a question about getting lots of delays on licensing permit issues from Transport Canada regional offices. And COVID was cited as one reason for some of the delays. What's your priority for service delivery, or is that just a regional responsibility? Is headquarters setting that, or are the regions setting the service standard? And where is the service standard now in the middle of a pandemic?
So first, service standard is set by headquarters. So I'll make that very clear. And it has been absolutely devastated by COVID, and I understand the delays that individuals have with regards to that. I'm gonna touch on a couple of the service pieces that we've heard from, hoping to address some questions. One is around medical examinations and medical assessments. So on average, on any given year, we have about 50 to 60,000 medical assessments that we get in to consider. And for the most part, prior to the pandemic, those assessments were by paper. In fact, just as the pandemic was coming, is where we launched our electronic medical record system. And as we went into the pandemic, there was about 5 to 10% of assessments we were getting via electronic records. Now, where we are in the pandemic right now, there's about 90% being received through electronic medical records. As you can imagine, during that paper and where offices were shut down, where mail offices were shut down, where transportation was shut down, those records, well, we continued operations in a hybrid setting. Those records sat there quite a long time in some cases, and that created a backlog, which we already had going into the pandemic, but not to the same degree. My first message to all of you is as you're looking at getting your medical examination, you're going to your CAMI for your assessment, find a CAMI that uses EMERS. Find a CAMI that submits electronic medical records. Your file will go much faster. The other pieces we've put in place with regards to medical records is you'll see that we've gone to an e-secure post through Canada Post, so that we're not reliant on paper records anymore. We've also taken a quality assurance pilot and looked at how we review all medical assessments, triaging them to focus on a greater on the more complex cases as opposed to some of the generic or less complex cases. At this time, I can say that month over month, we are now decreasing the backlog. I couldn't say that in June. I can say that coming out of the summer, month over month, we're decreasing the backlog based on some of these measures. Will continue to decrease the backlog as we digitalize all previous medical records, and as there's even a greater uptake of EMERS. So that's a service standard and one of the pieces. We're also looking at service standards in Atlantic Canada. I don't know, individuals might have seen it. Look at booking, exam booking. You called your service representative on these exams bookings. Sometimes exam bookings take anywhere between 15 and 60 minutes to actually book a location for you to go and take that exam. We are looking at digitalizing that system, and there was a pilot, very successful pilot in Atlantic Canada that's outlined that, and that'll hopefully allow for you to not have to spend that 60 minutes with a service person on trying to book your exam, and actually use a digitalized service. It's also going to free up our service representatives to address questions with regards to, say, medical records or other pieces. So that's another item that we moved much more quickly on because of the COVID pandemic to try and address. We've also seen around service standards, again, the amount of exams. So there was about a backlog of about 3,000 written exams to be written during the heart of the pandemic. That's out of about, let's say, about 18,000 we have a year. So we were looking at about anywhere between 3 and 9 month delays during the pandemic. We've moved and we've shifted. I'll send a shout out to I know one of your members, Chinook Helicopters, who helped us in the mass invigilation of exams. Businesses from all across aviation businesses from all across the country looking at helping us mass invigilate exams where our service centers couldn't be used during the pandemic. That's an area where we actually see there's continued benefit even after the pandemic to mass invigilate exams, so that we are able to again respond more quickly to those requests and actually handle more requests on in a greater volume. So that's another piece where we've looked at the service standard. I spoke about flight tests and the electronic booking of those. I think all of those will get to where you'll see again, and that'll directly impact, say, licensing and how well licensing applications come in and how quickly they're treated. It'll directly impact those by alleviating some of the other backlogs. I'll also say that from the other piece we're looking to digitalize is around our exams and how we enter them into our system to be assessed. So we have about 4,000 flight tests a year in Canada, and what we're doing is trying to digitalize, and we've piloted already. So designated ACPs can enter the PPC results directly into a secure web portal instead of through paper. So again, those individuals that are taking those flight tests are receiving those results. They're being assessed, and then they're receiving those results in a quicker basis. So those are all a few of the national projects that we're looking at to improve service standards.
I see. Very good. There's another question about SMS. And it's been around a long time. I mean, it's been 15 years since SMS was first said out loud, and it was intended to be applicable to all certificate holders, and we're still not there yet. But there is a question about, operators have been encouraged to implement SMS of their own. So they're hopefully experiencing some of the benefits of having it. But in terms of safety, but are they also getting the relief that was promised as far as SMS because they conduct the risk assessment of their own? Now, we don't have a regulatory backstop for any of this, at least in the helicopter industry, because there is no regulation as it relates to SMS, so there is no relief for doing a risk assessment. So is there any thought, given one of the questions is here, that an opportunity for operators to be able to do risk assessments and get relief if they have an SMS implemented of their own?
I'd say, is there a specific kind of a direction that we've provided on relief for risk assessments, independent of if you're regulated under SMS? No. I would say SMS is something, though, that we do. It's one of the areas where you'll see us. We've been doing a lot of internal work during the pandemic, knowing that the ability for industry to respond to the changes that we want to bring forward was more difficult during the pandemic, as you were dealing with the multitude of other things. I think you'll see where we are in SMS and who we would like to move forward on incorporating SMS in the next number of years, because we know regulatory process takes that long, is something we do want to re-engage with. I think we will be speaking about it at KRAC this week for those that are going to join on around our approach. We'll also be looking at the benefits of during, in the absence of approved regulations within the CARS, voluntary aspects, as you mentioned, Fred, around SMS. And that's where I think we could look at maybe there's some benefit that's transferred onto an organization that meets a particular voluntary framework that we have set up.
Gotcha. All right, thank you. A question, in the past, the difference between 702 and 703 operations and wildfires has been academic, since operational standards for both were quite similar. As we go forward, those differences are increasing. It's an incorrect assumption that wildfire ops are basically 702. However, the truth is both 702 and 703 operations are essential to wildfire operations. The new differences will have a serious impact on wildfire agencies. I mean, this has come up, I've mentioned it insofar as, ensuring that that wildfire operations and all of the associated operations, which means ferrying crews out from the camp or a hotel to the fire and then moving those same crews around and bringing them back, or even things like servicing fire towers, bringing groceries to a fire tower, or bringing people to a fire tower to change the person in the tower out, rotate them out. I think there has to be an inclusive and more fully articulated description of what is included in firefighting operations, including patrols and alerts and those sorts of things, so that you're not in the awkward position where you can't move them out from a camp to the fire, but you're going to move those same people around from all day on the fire, but you can't bring them back again. I think we need to have a more complete description of that. So I would agree with the person asking the question. It was Bob Spracklin, that we need to take a closer look at that insofar as it relates to the fatigue management regulations, for example, but also as it may apply to other elements and dimensions of the same firefighting operation as well.
Yeah, and I know that was part of the conversations we had with regards to the fatigue rules, Fred, that you brought up on a continuous basis on how to apply, how they may or may not apply. A particular firefighting wildfire operation may or may not apply to the fatigue rules. So it is something that we'll continue to examine when there are particular cases that you or an operator feels we need to again have a carve out, they're chafing against a particular rule, using your terminology, Fred. I'm not open to having a look at those. What my answer might be and what an operator might want might be different, but I'm always open to having an examination of that particular operation.
Okay. And in my mind, at least, at the very least, avoid those ridiculous scenarios where you can do the operation with the people, but you can't move the people to the site, for example. And you have to bring in a 703 pilot that hasn't exceeded the 703 limits to carry those same people. It seems crazy. So there are some very difficult scenarios that I think our industry could benefit from some clarification on in a dialogue with transport. Another question, and we are getting close to the end of time here. Delays we're seeing in regards to item like manual approvals. This has been on many of our agendas at this session, have more to do with TC staffing issues, lack of inspectors. How is this being addressed in terms of where are your staffing levels, and to what extent, has the federal employees will continue to work at home, I gather, for some uncertain period of time? And how will that affect their ability for the department to task up the jobs that require doing like manual approvals?
So working from home should not impact manuals approvals. I'll say that's first and foremost. Our return to work has been announced kind of more broadly with the government of Canada. You'll see some individuals return to work more. There are individuals at work now, and you'll see a greater return over the new year for sure. But those will be assessed based on the type of job that the individual is assigned to. From a manuals perspective and from a staffing levels perspective, we are at the same staffing level that we had going into the pandemic. There has been no change in staffing levels. In fact, we probably, just because it's a matter of course in the pandemic, are probably holding our individuals, retaining our individuals more during the pandemic, because there's less movement that I've experienced during the pandemic. So our staffing level is the same. Manuals delay though, likely it was not likely it was exuberated by the fact that there were other key priorities that had to be addressed during the pandemic as well, particularly around risk assessments. I mentioned that the 240 odd exemptions that we issued throughout the COVID were in addition to our regular process. Each one of those received the same amount of scrutiny. The risk assessment, the review by the particular party areas of transport that we needed to. So there were delays, and that included manuals and other aspects of our work.
All right, I think we're just about out of time here, Nick. Thank you so much for taking the time with us this afternoon. Really much appreciated. I will follow up with you on the HEC item that you referred to as well, because you may recall we had some issues around the advisory circular that was issued on HEC and how closely it dovetailed with the terms of the standards. So I'll have to familiarize myself with the example that you were citing. It doesn't spring to mind. So I'll touch base with you following on the meeting on that one. But thank you again for your willingness to participate today. And thank you everyone who answered questions. There were a couple that didn't get answered, with my apologies, but we are going to have to move on to the next session. So Nick, thank you very much.
Thanks everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks.